Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, filming wildlife. You can do it. Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Aditya Panda. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. Over to you, Aditya.
Thank you, Rob. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Daily Dose of Nature with me. Today's topic is it can be a slightly intimidating one. It certainly was for me. I'm really looking forward to discussing this subject, one which I have not presented on before. But before that, for those of you who are listening to my webinar for the first time, and for those of you who haven't traveled with me in the past, my name is Aditya Panda. I have been leading NatHab's India expeditions since 2016. I primarily lead the tiger trips in India, as we call them, the Grand India Wildlife Adventure, India Tiger Quest, and India Tiger Safari, which is a Photo Pro expedition. I'm based in Eastern India, Eastern Central India, and when I'm not leading NatHab expeditions, I work in tiger conservation, tiger and elephant conservation in wildlife habitats in this part of the country. So now let's get to our topic. See, I must make a disclaimer right at the beginning. I'm not a pro wildlife filmmaker. I have been doing wildlife photography for many years now. I lead Photo Pro expeditions and photo trips. But as a wildlife filmmaker, I consider myself an amateur, even that. But you see, until a few years ago, until fairly recently, photographers almost never, still photographers almost never dabbled in filmmaking. It was not even an option with most still cameras until a few years ago. The option for shooting movies was strictly something that was present in those little compact cameras, which were not meant for professional photography. And people who did amateur filmmaking or used a camcorder style camera most of the time, and the serious professionals once used really heavy duty gear. But times are changing. Today your camera, any kind of camera that you use, is as good at still photography as it is at filming movies. And some of our cameras, in fact, even the most basic DSLR or mirrorless camera today, is even the latest iPhones, are actually capable of filming cinema quality movies. So when cameras started, DSLRs started getting the movie recording option, it was tempting to start using it. And this video that you see of a leopard demolishing a sambar deer in Ranthambore National Park was one of the first videos that I filmed using a DSLR. There's a reason I put this video here, and that's because despite the amazing subject and content in it, there are a lot of mistakes, a lot of very amateurish mistakes that I've made with this video. You see, back then, we, as still photographers, had our cameras set for action freezing wildlife photography, right? And while we were indulging in that, we would occasionally just flip a switch and start recording video without putting in much thought into it. But over the years, I have learned and grown as somebody who can film some wildlife. And in today's webinar, I would like to share with you the things that I've learned, and hope that you will have something to learn from those, and find it all useful. See, all of us go on these trips, the kind of trips that Nat have organizes, and we all travel with all kinds of cameras. Some of us travel with only a smartphone. Some of us have a compact camera. Some of us are serious still photographers and carry good cameras. Um, and the conditions on these trips are such that for somebody wanting to do some serious filming, there are many challenges. Besides, a lot of people, well, the serious photographers rarely get into filming. Their minds and techniques are set for still photography, and the ones who are just collecting memories, just snapshots on their phone or on a compact camera, are also occasionally doing video, but a lot of times those videos are not of the highest possible quality or the best possible quality that their own cameras, whatever they might be, can potentially manage. So in today's webinar, my goal is that whether you're somebody who collects memories on a phone camera, or whether you're a still photographer who would like to get into wildlife filming, that all of you have something to learn from whatever I have learned over the years. So, speaking of that, a lot of us carry camcorders, or just randomly start filming while we're on trips, and we go back home with several minutes, if not hours, of footage, and a lot of it ends up like this. It's just like a video roll of your trip, without much planning, and with lots of content, but often with very little engaging content, if that's the right word. So the first thing to keep in mind when you start out at wildlife filmmaking is to not film for the sake of filming, but to film with a plan, to collect footage or to press that record button when you think you've got a good frame and a good subject, just like with still photography. Although with still photos, we get into the habit of, it's a bad habit, but a lot of us get into it, of shooting fairly recklessly at everything and anything, with the knowledge that we can always delete whatever is bad and just keep a few of the best pictures. But with video, that's not how it works. With video, you might be shooting like this, several minutes of footage, but 10 seconds of that or 5 seconds of that could be really good footage. And when you go back home, you can't really delete the whole video and end up losing those 5 seconds of good footage. A lot of times you don't even know that you have those 5 seconds of good footage, because the video is so long that you're just plain tired of seeing it. And if you want to share it with your friends or family or post it on social media, of course, nobody is going to watch minutes and minutes or hours and hours of footage. They want to see the exciting good bits. So when we go out filming, it is important to go with the mindset to shoot or film things only when something interesting is about to happen or might happen, or when the subject is in good view and in good light, and of course with some amount of planning on our behalf on how to compose the scene, how to expose, how to film, when to film, and when to stop filming, very important. So between that leopard that you saw in the previous slide, the shaky in and out of focus video of that leopard, and fairly recently, I have come some way. I found another leopard demolishing another kill, but in very different conditions and a very different leopard. This is a snow leopard, and while this video is not color graded, it's not post processed, it's straight raw out of the camera, you can see the difference in quality between this video and the video of the common leopard 2 slides ago. And you can see what a difference it makes. Here we have a fairly still video, steady focus, a steady frame, and that lets you focus on the subject and what it is doing and the story in the frame. And to get from there to here, there have been several things that I have learned, and today I'm going to share those with you. You see, filming can be fairly intimidating, as I was mentioning right at the beginning. The learning curve is fairly steep. Even the post-processing, that's another level of steepness. But I hope today I'll be able to give you bite-sized bits of information that you can implement and try out and learn and make yourselves better at. The first thing to work on when you transition from a still photographer, and all of us are still photographers in some way or the other. If you're not serious or amateur, still photographers with professional level cameras, we are still photographing with our phones and compact cameras, and we do a lot more still photography than at least the majority of us do a lot more still photography in our day-to-day lives than we do video. And the first thing that you need to do when you transition into video, into filming, is to take that still photographer mindset and put it aside and completely look at filming or completely look at the camera with a different perspective. There are many things that I'll tell you about that you will need to relearn as a filmmaker that do not work as a still photographer, and many things as a still photographer that do not work when filming. It takes, it covers the whole gamut of techniques, starting from exposure to composition, everything. What camera is the best camera for filming? Well, there are any number of choices. As I've always said, the best camera is the one you've got on you, especially when you're on these trips and really far from being able to buy new gear. Until fairly recently, the ubiquitous camcorder or handycam was everybody's go-to video camera, but those have nearly gone into extinction now, and your range of choices varies from smartphones to compact cameras to DSLRs and now the mirrorless cameras. And of course, if you're very serious about your filmmaking, you can always invest in a very high quality camcorder or video camera. I would say that the best cameras for filming wildlife, or let me put it this way, the easiest cameras for filming wildlife are, in no particular order, smartphones, compact cameras, and mirrorless cameras. Of these, mirrorless cameras, of course, are capable of giving you very, very high quality footage, almost cinema quality. Uh, you know, uh, some of them are even approved by the likes of Netflix. The mirrorless camera, the present day mirrorless camera, is a very, very capable video camera. DSLRs, and a lot of us shoot with them, including myself, are still primarily, still focused cameras and video cameras later. They have many challenges when it comes to filming video, and it's a bit of a, not just of a learning curve, but also a lot of practice that is required to be able to film decent footage with a DSLR. Mirrorless cameras are almost as good movie cameras as they are still cameras, and a lot of these prosumer, super zoom compact cameras are also really good movie cameras. Now let's, regardless of what camera you're shooting with, let's get the basics right. The basics of filming are that you should have, first rule is that you should have a very steady frame. If your camera isn't still, if it isn't supported either by your hand, if you're shooting handheld or using a tripod or a bean bag or something of that sort, then your frame is going to move around. And as you must have noticed in some of the frames that I showed you earlier today, a shaky frame is very unpleasant to look at. It can actually make people seasick, shake just ruins video. So the number one rule is to keep your frame still. If you're shooting with your phone, hold it still. If you're shooting with a handycam or a camcorder, hold it still. Next comes frame rate. Of course, you can't set frame rate in every kind of camera unless you're shooting with a DSLR or a mirrorless camera or a slightly pro camcorder, or one of the higher end compact cameras. It's usually one doesn't have the option of choosing what frame rate they want to shoot at. Some of the new smartphones, of course, also give you that option. So it's very important to set the right frame rate depending on what result you're looking at, and I'll explain frame rate later. Of course, just like with still photography, you have to set the right exposure, but unlike with still photography, you can't keep constantly changing the exposure, because then that's going to give you a flickery bit of video that will keep going dark and then bright and then dark again. So you can't do that. Remember what I said about a mindset change? I'll explain it later. Think about composition. Again, with wildlife filmmaking or any sort of filmmaking, the basic rules of composition, which is the rule of thirds, applies. But then there are very many things that change with composing when you're filming versus composing when you're shooting still. Bad habit of the camcorder days: don't zoom in and out unnecessarily. It again gives you a very shaky, very unstable frame. Decide if you want to follow the subject after having zoomed in on it, or whether you want a wider frame to show the subject moving through it. In most cases, the latter option is going to be the more pleasant sight. Don't shoot hours and hours of footage unnecessarily. Don't just keep the camera rolling as you go on your game drive or hike or whatever activity you're going on. Shoot in clips so that they're easier to go through, easier to sort through, and less tedious to watch or to show others. And one very important rule that most people forget when they're filming is to keep absolutely quiet. You want unless of course you want to give a running commentary of what is happening, keeping quiet is usually good because it lets you hear the natural sounds of whatever habitat you're in, and record those in your video. Handling your camera, how you hold your camera, how you move it, also changes when you're shooting film versus if you're shooting with the very same camera, still photos. I explained about how important it is to keep your camera steady and how it is important to use other support systems to help keep it steady. Panning, with the scene looks beautiful if it's done on a nice rock solid tripod with a smooth fluid head on it, but panning with the hand might not always give you pleasant results. And of course, there are a lot of accessories out there that you can attach to your camera to help as supporting aids to help you move your camera while you are hand holding it, or even while you have it mounted on a tripod. I'll talk about accessories again at the end of the webinar. When you're composing for video, you have to relearn a lot of things versus when you're composing for still pictures. When we are shooting still pictures, we tend to try and close in on the subject as much as we can. We zoom in, try and get close-ups, unless of course we're deliberately shooting a subject in a landscape. But with video, it becomes even more important to give some room to the subject in your frame, because your subject is likely to move while you're shooting, and you might not always be able to move your camera to accommodate your subject in a pleasant position on the frame. Very important that you leave room in the direction in which your subject is looking. Your subject should always be looking at the far end of the frame, which is, most of you know about negative space and positive space. If your subject is still, if it is an animal that is standing still or sitting still or lying down or looking at you, then it might be a good idea to zoom in close and show the details of that animal's face or body, and while doing that, always keep in mind that rule that I keep talking about of trying to get as close to eye level with the animal, or sometimes even lower. But don't be fixated with close-ups and portraits. Also try and show the environment. Remember the rule that I had said, it's a general rule. I mentioned this in one of my photography webinars in the past. The PIE rule, P-I-E, portrait, interaction, and environment. The moment you have shots of a subject in these three positions, be it still or video, the moment you have a nice portrait shot of the subject, some sort of interaction of the subject with either another animal of its species, or an animal of a different species, or even the interaction of the subject with its own environment, any sort of interaction. And then the moment you have footage of the subject in its environment, the moment you have all these three, you have a story to tell. So P-I-E, PIE, portrait, interaction, environment. Try and get these three shots of your subjects, and you will have a story to tell. One tendency we have with still photography is to continuously, because again, we are talking about wildlife photography here, and as still photographers, we tend to have long lenses. We tend to zoom in on the subject and keep moving the camera with the subject, no matter what it does, whether it's walking, whether it's running, whether it's in flight. We tend to have a tight frame moving with the subject. Now, you can't do that with film. You have to do the opposite. You have to zoom out and you have to leave room in the frame for the subject to move about. That way, you show the subject in action in its environment. Remember, it is the frame, the whole frame, that tells the story. The subject is not the story. The subject is just a character in the whole story. So as long as you keep that in mind, it's going to really help you get your composition right. Of course, the very basic rule of the thirds, which is if you divide your frame into 3 equal halves, horizontally and vertically, and you place your subject in any of the intersections depending on what it is doing, which way it is looking, etc., you will have generally a very pleasant composition. One of the biggest challenges I faced as I started shooting more and more video with my DSLRs was focusing. As still photographers, we are fixated, we are completely obsessed with getting tack sharp focus each and every time. We are absolutely obsessed with getting the eyes absolutely sharp in each and every frame. Now, it took me a very long time to unlearn that when shooting video. Number one, unless if you're shooting with one of the modern mirrorless cameras that have bird eye autofocus and animal eye autofocus and can track that focus, like magic. Unless if you have that, it is very difficult with most kinds of cameras to have absolutely pinpoint sharp focus 100% of the time, especially with moving subjects. It's not easy. Cameras struggle, DSLRs especially, they struggle to autofocus, which is why when I'm shooting video, I'm usually manual focusing, or at least I'm not in continuous autofocus, because I know that way it's not going to be possible for me to maintain that focus as the subject moves around, as the subject moves its head around. It's much better to just sort of gain focus, initial focus, and then leave it be and see, if the animal is moving its head around, a few feet or a few inches from what would be critical focus. It doesn't matter. You can't really notice it on the screen. You can't really notice it on film, on a moving image. Don't be fixated with that. Because I was fixated with that initially, I ended up losing a lot of what could have been quality footage. What I ended up getting by trying to achieve super sharp focus all the time was a frame that would blur in and out of focus, and that was very unpleasant. You noticed that in the leopard video, I'm sure, and the tiger video that I put after that. Do practice your manual focus, and do practice follow focus. Follow focus is when you are trying to maintain focus on a subject that is moving in or out of the frame. It doesn't always work. It's very hit and miss. It is very difficult skill to master. You do get rigs and aids that help you follow focus, by turning a knob that very slowly rotates your focusing ring, but it is still very difficult. But it is worth practicing those skills. And as I was mentioning, DSLRs aren't really great at follow focusing on their own when it comes to animal subjects. But the mirrorless cameras these days are really good at it. They can do amazing subject tracking even through grass and twigs and vegetation and things like that. So if you're shooting with the mirrorless camera, definitely try out your animal eye autofocus or bird eye autofocus. Phones are also fairly good at compact cameras and camcorders are also fairly good at maintaining focus on a moving subject. For that very same reason, that it is very difficult to maintain focus, it is always helpful to shoot with a narrow aperture if you're shooting with a mirrorless or a DSLR, because then you have a greater depth of field, and that gives you a lot of leeway when it comes to focus. But you know, nothing really matches the quality of sharp subject with very shallow depth of field. You know, it makes it look very cinematic. Try that with subjects that are sitting still and subjects that are moving parallel to you. When a subject is moving away, I found that it is just better to have a narrow aperture. When a subject is walking into a frame, what you can do is pre-focus. You can sort of predict where it is going to be in a little while, and you can pre-focus in that spot and wait. And the subject, as it moves into the frame, will first appear blurred and then gradually become sharper and sharper and sharper till it reaches that hyperfocal distance where you have pre-focused your lens and are waiting, and that can look really nice. So those are some of the things to keep in mind when focusing on an animal subject or a bird subject. Next, let's talk of frame rates. A lot of you have all kinds of cameras, and these cameras all boast, 120 frames per second or 60 frames per second, starting all the way down from 24 frames per second. Now, what is a frame rate? As we all know, a video is nothing but a number of still pictures played really quickly, played back really quickly, and that gives you the sense of motion, and that really is what video is. Now, frame rate is it defines the number of frames that are played back per second when you're watching the video, right? 24 frames per second is going to play 24 individual still photos per second, giving you the effect of a moving picture. 60 frames per second will play back 60 frames in the same second, and so on and so forth. Now, what difference does that make? What difference does it make to the actual video that you're watching? Now, this comparative picture will give you the answer. You see, at 24 frames per second, a still frame from that video shows a very blurred individual, a very blurred subject. Slightly less blur at 30 frames per second, and almost like a still photo at 60 frames per second. So with video, again, I'll keep going back to relearning and changing our mindset from stills. With still, when shooting still photos of wildlife, our objective is to freeze action most of the time. Most of the time, our objective is to freeze action. With video, our objective is to show motion. So it's the opposite, really. 24 frames per second playback is going to give you a much smoother video, show very natural motion, whereas 60 frames per second is not really going to, it's not going to show you as smooth and natural a motion as 24 frames per second, but it is going to show you more detail. So you see, here's an example. Again, look at how the tennis ball looks at 60 frames per second versus how it looks at 120 frames per second. So 24 frames per second is usually what we see in cinema, in movies. When we go out to a theater, the movies that we watch, most of them are filmed and played back at 24 frames per second, which is why movie looks different. All of us have noticed that movies look different from sitcoms or the news that we see on TV. A lot of us can't really put the finger on exactly what is different, but there is something cinematic about movies that is not on your regular TV program. And that's because TV usually shows, the standard frame rate for TV, television footage is 25 frames per second in the US and 30 frames per second in Europe. And when you watch a football game or cricket here in India, or tennis, that is usually sports events are usually played back at 50 or 60 frames per second. When you are playing a video game, that might be playing at 120 frames per second. But when you film at 120 frames per second or 60 frames per second and play that back at 24 or 30 frames per second, then that gives you the effect of slow motion. That is what slow motion is. If you shoot at 60 or 50 or 100 or 120 frames per second and play that back at 24 frames per second, that gives you slow motion. And a lot of wildlife looks good in slow motion. So that was frame rates for you in a gist. The rules of exposure are very different in filming when it comes, when compared to still photography. Now, if you're shooting with a compact camera or a camcorder or your phone, you might have very little control on the exposure parameters because you simply, in many cases, do not have the option to change that. Which is why when you shoot a video on a phone, outdoors especially, the video keeps getting brighter and darker and brighter and darker depending upon what's happening in it. Because your phone is doing the thinking for you, or your camcorder is doing your doing the thinking for you, and just you have very little control on your exposure. But if you're shooting with a mirrorless camera or slightly a less than consumer or more than consumer camcorder or compact super zoom camera or a DSLR, then you have full control over the three basic parameters of exposure, that is shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And the golden rule set in stone for filming to get the most natural, the most jitter-free results is that your shutter speed must be twice that of your frame rate. And that's just a rule. You can't change it. It works really well. If you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you have to set your shutter speed to 1/48 of a second. A lot of cameras do not have 1/48 option, so you can just choose the nearest value, which is 1/50th. If you're shooting with slow motion in mind, if you're shooting at 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second, then equivalently you have to increase the shutter speed to 1 1/20th of a second or 1/25th of a second, depending on what your camera lets you choose, and 2/40th of a second if you're shooting at 120 frames per second. Research has found that when shooting with digital, modern digital SLR cameras or mirrorless cameras or any digital camera, if you use your ISO in multiples of 160, you get the best results and the least amount of noise. So when filming, unlike in stills, don't just use the lowest possible ISO. Make sure that it is in a multiple of 160. Now that basically leaves you with aperture as your only real control parameter for containing your exposure. And with aperture, wide open aperture will give you a shallow depth of field, giving you a very cinematic sort of feel to your footage. And a narrow aperture is going to give you a very deep depth of field, which is great for landscapes and things like that. And for it also helps you keep your subject in focus. Now, what do you do in broad daylight when you can't go over 1/50th of a second or 1/20th of a second shutter speed, and you have used the narrowest of your aperture and the lowest of your ISO, and there is still plenty of light just blowing out the highlights of your picture, of your video. That is a real problem with wildlife. We mostly shoot outdoors, and sometimes the problem with filming a lot of the times, unlike with still photography, is that there is too much light. In still photography, we are always trying to get fast shutter speeds, and there's usually always too little light for us. But in filming, there's the problem of plenty. So to contain that, a very useful tactic is to have a neutral density filter. A neutral density filter basically cuts the amount of light entering your lens, and that really helps you put exposure under control and prevents it from blowing out. The neutral density filters come in various ratings: ND2, 6, 8, and so on. The larger the number, the darker the filter. There are also variable ND filters that you can get, which if you rotate, you can change the amount of light that you wish to allow into your camera. So ND filters are a very useful tool, a very useful accessory for your filmmaking. Now, for precisely the same reason as I was mentioning earlier, often when it is too dark to photograph still pictures, you can still film. And I filmed this tiger in Kanha Tiger Reserve in Central India on a Grand India Wildlife Adventure when it was nearly sunset, and the tiger was very far away, too far away in fact to get decent still pictures of it. And it was too dark actually to shoot stills, and even with our naked eyes we could barely see the tiger. But because when I'm filming at a very slow shutter speed, this was 1/50th of a second probably, and even with my aperture wide open, this wasn't even wide open by the way, but you could get your aperture wide open, and you could bump up your ISO a bit, and you can easily film in near dark conditions. Again, this video, I must say, is raw, straight out of the camera. It hasn't been color graded, or the exposure hasn't been corrected, but you can see that it is a pretty good base video to start post-production on and make it look really nice. Which brings me to the topic of what to shoot when you're on these trips. Of course, these trips, are not filming trips. You will be, challenged in many ways. There'll be other people in your Jeep, or when you're walking around, you're also limited by an itinerary. So if they're not really filming expeditions, you can't really get the kind of footage that you might want to get. You will have to make the best of what you see. So and in today's day and age of social media, most people like to post little clips of 30 seconds or less on Instagram as reels, or they want to have little videos that they can share with their friends and family on WhatsApp. And these videos are usually limited to about 30 seconds. So as long as you have some sort of engaging content happening, for example, here we have a tigress sitting, and she's not really doing anything. She's just sitting, but she turns her face, looks at you, then looks away a little and yawns, and then looks back. And that is a very nice, short, engaging clip, and a really good memory versus, say, just a still photo of that. So try and shoot a lot of these clips. Don't make them too long. Clips are nice. Clips are easy to share, and easy to they're easy file sizes to handle. You can email them easily without having to reduce the file size and do things like that. But you might also want to shoot something like in a movie style or a documentary style, and in that case it is important to have a storyline in mind. And to go back to PI, portrait interaction environment, and you can sit down and write down a storyline, list down what clips that you want to get, and then according to your itinerary, have a number of clips lined up that can then be weaved together into a story, and then you have a movie. And very important not to forget that sound is important. A lot of times while we are filming, people are talking about and they don't pay so much attention to sound. But if you can, especially in wild settings, you can get some really, really interesting results. But of course, it is not always possible, and sometimes there is no sound available. So in those cases, and people are talking in the background, you just can't do anything about it. So in those cases, don't fret too much, don't break your head over it. You can always add pleasing music or pleasing background sounds later. And talking of later, it is always useful to invest a little learning in post-production. Post-production sounds really scary. It's not something that is only done in Hollywood. There are a number of free apps online that you can download onto your phone or your computer, which are fairly easy to use to edit your videos yourself and put them together in a timeline to form a story. And how to edit video is going to be a whole webinar in itself, and I can't really talk about it or explain it in one slide, but it is worthwhile to invest your time in learning the basics of video post-production. And one of the easiest ways to do that is by downloading these very, very user-friendly apps these days that are available on any app store on your phone or your computer. And of course, to help make your camera, whatever camera it is, a better video camera, there are a number of accessories and equipment kits that are available. Do look those up, but before that, first try and get the basics right. Go through what I explained in today's webinar. Watch this webinar again later, because it's going to be recorded and it's going to be there on the website. And try and practice these on your dog, on your cat, on your neighborhood wildlife, on people, and hopefully you'll start to enjoy filming and get some practice before you go on your next big adventure. And before I start the question and answer session, I'll just let this video run. This just puts together random clips from India Tiger Quest trips, not this season, but last season. Enjoy watching this, and I look forward to the questions you have to throw at me. Rob, what questions do we have today?
All right, thank you, Aditya. Now, before we start in with the questions, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. So, what is the best camera to use for filming a moving animal?
Filming a moving animal?
Yes, sir.
Well, the modern mirrorless cameras are, by any measure, the best cameras to film moving animals, because they've got this voodoo in them called animal eye tracking and bird eye tracking, which really work like magic. And there's nothing better really that I can think than those to film moving animals with, absolutely pinpoint focus all through. And if you don't have a mirrorless camera, then a camcorder or one of the what we call them, prosumer zooms or super zoom compact cameras are also fairly good at keeping focus on moving animals.
Great, thank you for that. So one of our guests has a Nikon D850, and I was wondering what the best card for that is. Is the XQD Express okay for filming video?
Yes, when you're filming video, the camera is writing a tremendous amount of data, far more than when you're shooting still. A tremendous amount of data on your card, so it always helps to have the fastest possible card. And the XQD cards are really, really fast.
Great, thanks. So let's talk about post-production for a second. Are there any apps or software that you can recommend to us?
Well, there's if you're Apple users, MacBook users, iMovie is a great app to get started with. Your PC or Windows users, I think they had something called Movie Maker. Besides, there are a lot of other free apps that you can get down and get started with. There are other apps for more advanced users, like Final Cut Pro, which is really pro stuff. But with a little bit of investment in the learning curve, there's nothing like those apps like Final Cut Pro, to produce really production quality.
The Tigress has gotten up to the young Tigress.
Gotcha. Well, thank you, Aditya. Unfortunately, that is the last question that we do have for today. So I'm going to throw it back to you for some closing comments.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, everyone. I really hope you found today's webinar useful, and I can't wait to see all the comments you have about it. And I look forward to seeing you again very soon on another episode of Thank you.
Aditya, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I would also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Now, if you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathap.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We will see you next time.